Night pressed lightly against the windows of Washington, and the city's many rooms, lit by desk lamps and computer screens and the quiet eyes of those who keep watch, seemed to float inside a larger darkness that listened and remembered. The air outside held the dry leaf smell of winter and the metallic hush of distant traffic, and somewhere beyond the ring roads a small footbridge stood above a creek, the boards worn smooth by shoes that had crossed it without ceremony. The bridge had learned how to keep a secret. It had also learned how to give one up. In such a city of rules and rituals and passwords, a question moved through the unheated spaces like a draft that could never be fully sealed. How can a life that appears so sturdy and dutiful contain another life beneath it? And what does it cost a nation to discover the truth too late to keep faith unbroken? He had the posture of a person who had spent many years being careful with his words. The suit was sensible, the tie without flourish, the hairline that surrendered gradually to time rather than to vanity. In a hallway or an elevator, his expression rested in a place that discouraged curiosity without inviting offense. He spoke in complete sentences that landed softly and disappeared. He did not mind if people found him solemn. He preferred it. He had been raised in a city that measured its weather with blunt honesty, and his father had earned a living in a uniform that taught a boy to believe that structure could push back the chaos that grows in the cracks of a neighborhood. The bureau taught him the art of moving inside a system where every file lived on a shelf that had earned its name by being exactly where it should be. He learned the respectful language of reports and the cadences of briefings where nothing could be said out loud until it had been said twice in the mind. He learned how to believe in a line that begins with oath and ends with the idea of a country that expects to be protected without being told what dangers have been turned away at its borders. He found comfort in the knowledge that his work would never belong to applause, that the best victories were the kind nobody heard about, and that his life might someday be summarized as a list of days during which no one discovered the violence that had been planned against them. At home in Virginia he wore another kind of silence, the kind that husbands wear when they have chosen faith as the architecture of a house and surrender as the color of its walls. The dining room held a table that remembered holiday meals and the private toasts of anniversaries. A family portrait faced the piano and the shelves where paperbacks shared space with devotionals and framed photographs of children standing in sun that had forgiven everything. Sunday mornings carried the habitudes of church, and the ritual of the week returned to its groove as predictably as a needle that finds the channel it has worn into vinyl. He was a man who seemed to move toward what others move toward, which is a very effective way to step away from them without being noticed. He worked late for reasons he could explain without lying, and he brought home the tired body of an honest servant of a large institution. In the neighborhood, parents waved, and the little park where people walked dogs collected his footprints beside their own. The world that loved surfaces saw exactly what it wanted to see, and the surface rewarded that attention with nothing alarming. A career grows like a tree, ring by ring, almost invisible while it is happening and impossible to confuse once it has revealed its shape. He advanced in a way that never threatened anyone else's ambition because he never seemed to be competing for the heights. He preferred the middle rooms where decisions feel solid and where one can gather information that helps other people's choices look wise. In those rooms he learned how information moves, how suspicion sharpens or dulls, and how the guardrails of a bureaucracy become very interesting to those who want to drive along the shoulder without being seen. He would be described later as ordinary, a word that holds both safety and danger inside it. Ordinary can be camouflage. Ordinary can be the glove that hides the hand. Those who would spend years combing his past would eventually discover that nothing was as simple as it looked, because simplicity is a trick the self plays when it grows tired of complexity. He used that trick the way a chess player uses the slow square in the middle of the board that nobody defends until too late. It did not happen with a flourish. A decision of this size rarely does. The first letter sat upon a desk inside an office far from the yard where his children played. The letter did not introduce a man with a taste for drama. It introduced a mind that preferred order and control, a mind that presented itself to strangers as an instrument they might find useful if handled correctly. The writer proposed a relationship that would never require a meeting, a relationship that would be safer if it remained a set of exchanges between two shadows who never stepped into each other's light. He adopted a name that did not belong to him, not to steal a soul but to move around the city without being asked to show his papers. He invented the idea that a chalk mark could be a sentence, and that a plastic bag tucked beneath a bridge could become a library of secrets if the librarian learned how to trust the person who checked them out. The other side, whose offices did not flush with embarrassment when asked to justify their curiosity, read the letter and saw profit without risk, and they wrote back with the same language of control. The city taught him the discipline of walking routes that the mind could memorize even while thinking about other things. He learned to notice the gaze that lingers and the tire that returns again and again to the same block and the man in the coffee shop who reads a paper that never turns its page. He learned to erase himself, not by disappearing from the lives he already lived, but by doubling his care inside them. A person who wants to hide in the middle of a crowd must look like the future the crowd desires for itself. He grew more official in his official capacities and more dependable to those who depended upon him, and all the while he wrote in a different voice to people who wanted what he could carry without sweating. In another life, and he was now fully assembling a life that could be reasonably called another, he visited rooms where the host was not the person who answered the door. He discussed topics that he did not earlier believe would ever interest him, and he found that his mind loved the thought of being the central pivot in a machine that would never offer a statue or a medal or a thank you, only silence and cash and the thrill that comes from proving you know something others would pay to be told. Money arrived as if from a patient and invisible employer. It came inside containers that would look ridiculous if anyone had photographed them, since secrecy often clings to items that have to hide even when they are attractive enough to be left on a table at a party. He won ornaments that he hid in plain sight because nothing is more dangerous to a secret than locking it in a safe. He invented ways to make himself look generous without being asked to explain the arithmetic. A gift here, a decision there, the kind of life that a neighborhood measures with a ruler that has space for pride but not for envy. There was a confession at one point, the kind that faith requires of those who have committed themselves to discipline and who hope that ritual can do the work that character is failing to do. He sat across from a listener who understood that words can change the shape of a day, and he promised what men promise when they want to equate intention with action. He broke with his other life for a time, or told himself that he did, and then his mind returned to the gravity it had lately discovered, the gravity of being central to something that no one else in his ordinary rooms had the courage to admit they envied. The route to the bridge became the route to the office and the church and the grocery, all braided together into a pattern that did not look like a pattern unless a person drew it on a map after years of suspicion. He marked a signpost with the smallest gesture of chalk, a signal that meant something to a pair of watchers who walked in another country and who would fly information across the ocean as easily as seagulls cross the Potomac. He slid a package where rain could not find it and walked away with the body language of a man who has spoken to no one. The creek carried small leaves past a stone that had been there longer than any name. The bridge kept the secret, and the office across town received the secret, and the world above ground continued to believe that structure protected it from the tastes of men. He learned to love the routine that hid him. He learned to wear a gray suit that never looked greedy for light. He learned to look bored just enough to make his presence fade from photographs, even when the photograph was only the memory of a coworker who would later testify that nothing about him suggested a man who was breaking the language of loyalty into small pieces and using them as tokens to pay for a different life. He mastered the currency of inside jokes without ever withdrawing too much from the account. He joined the conversations that collect in break rooms without ever spending the kind of story that would make people want to follow him out the door. At home, he took his children to school and to sports and to the houses of friends who owned the same kinds of couches and ate the same kinds of dinners. He carried groceries from the door to the counter with a tired grin that gave no hint of calculation. He folded laundry while the news delivered an outline of the world in the confident voice of a stranger who would never learn precisely how much they did not know. On Sunday, he knelt with a congregation that included people he would later harm without ever learning their names, and he considered the difference between ritual and change. He practiced devotion as a set of acts, while his mind continued to bow elsewhere. The other life did not always look like danger. Sometimes it looked like language, clean and elegant, written with the assurance of a person who believes they can impose meaning upon a document so completely that the paper would fall silent if asked to disagree. He wrote letters that loved a certain tone, the tone of a teacher who refuses to meet his students in person because he fears they will ask more of him than he wants to give. He told the other side what would make them clever. He told them how to avoid traps, which is always the most valuable gift a spy can offer. He shook his head at their errors in prose that wore a thin smile, and they responded with the flattering obedience that money always learns quickly. He had favorite places because everyone does, and it is difficult for even the most careful life not to leave marks upon the world it favors. He liked the park with the creek and the silent bridge, and the path that led to the little concrete square where a package could be left without the curiosity of a child or the inconvenience of a gardener. He liked the way a chalk mark could say everything that mattered to people who knew the alphabet of fear. He liked the taste of victory when he saw in a newspaper a story that made him believe that his advice had been read and obeyed. In offices where budgets and personnel and investigations all intersected like braids made of thinner braids, people sometimes argued in tones that approached anger. They argued about losses that did not make sense. They argued about plans that had failed for reasons no post-mission analysis could explain. They argued about whether human error could be this consistent and this cruel. Some suggested a mole with the courage of those who prefer unpleasant truth to soothing confusion. Others rejected the idea, not because they were incapable of suspicion, but because they understood how painful and destabilizing it is to suggest that a colleague has decided to be something other than a colleague. For the man in the gray suit, the quiet suspicion began to taste like a spice he had learned to enjoy. He believed that his ability to move in two worlds without being pushed out of either was proof that he had found the seam in the fabric of reality. He searched for his own name inside systems that were intended to find people like him, and he discovered nothing that frightened him. The routes he walked did not grow shorter, but the fear inside those routes learned to shake hands with a darker cousin called arrogance. He believed that a man who had chosen not to be caught could never be caught. The bridge caught that belief the way a tree catches years inside its trunk and makes rings that can be counted later by a stranger with a saw. There are rooms where the walls seem to lean inward, not because the building is old but because the air inside is heavy with a kind of certainty that cannot yet be proven and therefore hurts its keepers the way an untold truth hurts a child. In such rooms a small group of people agreed that something essential had gone missing within their house. The losses were too precise to be blamed on laziness. The enemy had been warned too often to be credited with luck. A hand was reaching into their work and adjusting the results, and the fingers on that hand belonged to someone who knew when to press and when to lift away. They began with arithmetic. They counted operations that had stumbled against invisible furniture. They counted the reports that had arrived where they did not belong. They counted the names that had been turned into windows through which strangers could see plans that were supposed to remain unphotographed. The numbers made a map that pointed inward rather than outward, and the small group decided that isolation would be their friend. They spoke in corridors away from ears they could not trust, and they carried into those conversations the kind of resolve that does not flicker when the day grows old. Information arrived from across the ocean in an envelope that had been walked from desk to desk by men who wanted to know whether they were selling a key or a story about a key. Inside were pieces of a puzzle that already lived inside the heads of those who had been imagining it. A name did not appear in bold letters, but an alias did, and a trace of a voice, and a fingerprint that could be married to a letter the way a detective marries two strangers by finding a photograph where both once stood smiling into the same light. The small group felt the first real breath of relief they had allowed themselves in months. They had a shape inside their sights, and the shape looked familiar. With that confidence they built a smaller world for the man they suspected. A world inside the larger organization where he would walk corridors scrubbed of real work and room after room of tasks designed to keep his hands busy while preventing his hands from reaching for anything they could not afford to lose. They gave him an assistant, a young man who had the gift of being at once attentive and invisible, a young man with eyes that could register boredom without falling asleep, a young man who understood that his duty was to carry silence like a briefcase and to trim away every piece of ego that would make him visible to a person who loved the mirror too much. The young man sat across from the quiet senior and learned the rhythm of his footsteps and the scent of the cologne that remained on the handle of the car door after he stepped away. The watchers studied their target the way gardeners study weather. They learned what made him step quicker and what made him slow down. They borrowed his devices when he thought he had placed them somewhere private, and they copied the songs on them without changing a note. They followed him to lunch and from lunch and each time back to the office where the fluorescent light made even the most dangerous man look like a bookkeeper. They told no one else what they knew, because a leak within a leak is not a luxury that even the brave can afford. A date appeared on their map the way a pin appears in the hand of a person assembling a display. They believed he would visit the park with the little bridge again, because men are married to their habits in a way they can never admit. They gathered quietly around that location and kept their eyes where they needed to be. Their minds rehearsed the moment when the two lives would collide and become one, because the body must practice the future if it hopes to perform it without error. They strength tested the idea of bringing all of this to an end without turning the city into a scene that would scare the children who had brought their dogs for a run. If you're still watching, please subscribe so that more people can discover these powerful true stories. The weather had settled on a calm that felt almost indulgent. In the park, the air waited for a reason to move. The creek kept its voice low and consistent. A man left his car with a bag in his hand that could have belonged to any person running a gentle errand. His shoes met the path with the confidence of an old commute, and the trees looked down without concern because trees do not bother with the morality of those who walk in their shade. The bridge waited for him as it had waited for him many times before. It had held children and joggers and couples who paused to pretend the moment would last forever, and today it would hold the weight of a choice becoming visible to the world. He knelt in the private grammar of a man who ties a shoe or who checks a briefcase for a pen, and he placed the package where the planned handoff could find it. He stood and walked away with the body language of anyone who has decided to let gravity finish the job. His car accepted him as if nothing had happened, and for the space of a breath he believed that nothing had. Then the world changed its mind. Men who had practiced their steps for months completed the dance in a measured ring that became a definition. The bag remained a few yards away as if it had decided to become a witness. He was asked to put his hands where everyone could see them, and he did so with the composure of a man who had rehearsed this scene in the theater of his mind and who had never believed it would play upon an actual stage. He looked into faces that did not hate him and did not love him, and he understood the difference between being the center of the map and being a man in a park whose plans had been seen through by people he had underestimated. A sentence left his mouth, the kind a proud person speaks when the world has refused to obey. A sentence that suggested the clock had finally caught him after a race he had believed he could finish far ahead of it. They drove him to a place that had been prepared for this conversation. They took from him what a person surrenders when the next chapter has been written by other hands. The young assistant who had smiled without smiling returned home late and sat in a quiet room and let the silence finally vibrate. The small group of watchers exhaled in a way they had forbidden themselves to do for months. The agencies inside the larger format of a government that employs many such agencies responded with the choreographies they had designed in case of such a win. Across the ocean, a different building felt the tremor of a loss that had been coming for longer than anyone could admit without embarrassment. There is a room in every tragedy where a ledger waits with the patience of a sleeper who refuses to wake. In that room, the work is to count the cost. It is not a job that people should take without understanding the toll it will levy upon their dreams. The investigators began to tally, though they knew the tally would never persuade anyone that justice had solved anything. They listed operations that had been mended too late to be useful. They listed sources whose names now belonged to a different kind of conversation, the kind held in countries where graves are unmarked. They listed projects that had been sensible until a single sentence spoken in a different city had transformed them into food for predators. Each line on the ledger had a face behind it, and the faces were not simply symbols of national interest. Some were people who had been brave enough to take a risk because they believed that their children deserved a world where the decisions made in their country's highest offices were open to the daylight of accountability. The sections of the government that still allowed themselves to remember individual names spoke those names in rooms where they were not being recorded. Friends of the fallen learned by a kind of pulse that something had gone wrong in ways that could not be described, and their lives curled inward around a wound that did not have a shape anyone could treat. In this part of the story, the word damage sits down as a guest that will not leave. The tunnel under an embassy, the kind of story that used to appear in films as a gesture to the extreme imaginations of screenwriters, turned out to be a fact that had been turned useless by a conversation between a proud man and the people who had learned how to exploit his hunger for influence. The idea that one country could listen to another through pipes and wires and soil had been turned into a stale joke in rooms where laughter is not encouraged. that an entire architecture of risk had been neutralized by a single disloyal mouth burned through teams of professionals who had built that architecture with more hope than anyone wants to admit engineers sometimes need. Back in Virginia, drawers were opened that had never been opened before by anyone except a single person who preferred order to liveliness. Papers were found that read like a second memory superimposed upon the first. Letters drafted with the care of a professor who expects his students to underline his favorite points lay beneath office files that now seemed boring in a way that only guilty men can keep office files boring. Financial traces appeared and disappeared and reappeared as if they were shy animals who wanted to be seen by people who would know how to count them. Diamonds can be stored inside things that have never worn jewels, and sometimes the glitter appears where housekeeping insists no dust should ever survive. Beyond the counting lay the storm of shame. An institution that insists upon integrity in the names of others must teach itself how to speak the language of repentance without tearing down its own house to satisfy the hunger of those who love the sound of destruction. The Bureau looked inward and outward at the same time, and in that posture it began to build something that could survive this injury, a structure that would allow it to admit error and keep working with dignity. It is a kind of genius, this ability to remain standing while apologizing to the nation one is tasked to protect. The courtroom is a stage that pretends it does not know what a stage is. It insists upon fact and upon rules that allow fact to arrive in an acceptable uniform. The man who had walked under bridges and written letters with the arrogance of a teacher stepped into that room in clothing chosen by the same system that now owned the next years of his life. He sat where those accused sit and watched the faces of people who did not allow themselves to despise him because the structure requires that kind of control. He spoke in a voice that did not tremble and that did not swagger. He accepted a bargain that would keep him alive while removing from him the luxury of a horizon. The words life without the possibility of parole can sound like something a politician wrote until they are spoken to a person who knows that life is not only a word. The man traveled to a place where the sky remains visible through small windows that specialize in measuring a person's appetite for hope. He arranged his days in the pattern that all such places require, and he practiced the art of concluding that the smallest complaint is a waste of energy. He loved God again with a concentration that suggested he was speaking to a judge who does not consult case law. He wrote letters that a historian will one day read with a frown. Back in the offices where he had once spoken with a voice that made junior colleagues pretend to be listening with admiration, another person moved into his chair and placed a new photograph upon the desk and wrote new words upon fresh paper that the building allowed into its rooms each morning. The corridor that had been his became an ordinary stretch of carpet again. People still walked upon it without noticing that it housed a story that had nearly broken the trust between a country and the people who run errands for it with the seriousness of monks. The young assistant who had sat across from him, who had learned how to be invisible in the presence of a mind that had never thought it needed to watch the invisible, learned to build a different life. He carried with him the steady conviction that patience is the most underrated courage. He believed that what he had done had been useful not because it had put a man in a cell, but because it had strengthened the argument that the house must continue to stand. In later years, when he told the story, he spoke with gratitude to those who had stood with him in the kind of silence that allows a person to hear the important footsteps. The country read the headlines and then, as countries must, return to the smaller dramas that make a society feel alive. There were bills to pay and children to teach and highways to drive and lawns to cut. Trust does not repair itself like a wound that can be stitched. It must be practiced like a song. The Bureau learned to hum that song even on days when its throat felt tight. It examined its locks and its training, and it adopted new habits that would make another such double life harder to sustain, even if no house can ever promise that it will never again accommodate the ambitions of a man who loves secrets more than he loves truth. Years later, the park looks like any ordinary kindness that a county offers its people. Children cross the bridge with energy that makes their parents smile in recognition of a previous version of themselves. Dogs pause to drink from the shallow places, and the creek goes on making its small and loyal sound. Leaves gather against stones where the water shoulders around them, and the light that finds the hollow beneath the bridge shifts from morning to afternoon and back again. The bridge does not say anything about the day it learned a secret it did not want to know. The bridge understands that wood is expected to remember only its own grain. In offices scattered across a city that will forever pretend to be uninterested in drama, people still keep watch. They check files and they run audits, and they learn the faces of colleagues with a kind of love that refuses to exaggerate. They also accept, with a maturity that not every citizen can bear to practice, that certainty is the rarest luxury. They look for patterns, and they study the art of teaching a large organization to notice when a person has begun to live a second life in the corridors beside them. They design forms that require signatures and systems that record who visits which room and when. They remind themselves that the temptation to build an inner empire is older than every badge in the building. The man who had once been the center of so many counterweight stories grew older in a place where food arrives through a slot, and where the weather must be learned by observing details that chapters of sky cannot convey. He aged as slowly as any human being who takes little exercise and receives news that has been filtered until it cannot hurt him more than it has to. He held his faith like a coin in his hand, turning it over for reassurance. He wrote versions of his past that removed from it the parts that people who love honesty would want to leave in. Those drafts were his attempt to make a different kind of loyalty the central fact of his life, a loyalty to explanation rather than to truth. For those who suffered because of his choices, the bridge is an insult. For those who only learned about the case on the other side of a television screen, the bridge is a symbol that will not force them to change their lives. For the people who continue to stand watch, the bridge is a teacher. It shows them that even a gentle place can carry a gravity capable of pulling a city into a story it wishes it did not have to tell. It shows them that a plan can look boring for years, and then, in a single moment, reveal that boredom is a costume a very dangerous person prefers to wear. When night folds the city back into its patient shape, and the streetlights gather in small assemblies across suburban streets, the house lights within the bureau glow as they always have. Those who carry the keys keep the keys. Those who open doors open them with steadier hands than before. Those who worry that trust has become too fragile remind themselves that trust is only strong when it is tested. In these rooms, where fluorescent light has taught people how to see without the comfort of shadows, the question that opened this story returns with a different weight. How can a life that appears so sturdy and dutiful contain another life beneath it? The answer is simple and terrible. A person writes it that way. A person finds a seam and decides to walk along it until the fabric splits. In the park, the creek keeps talking to itself, unconcerned with human vows. In the city, the offices keep their rhythm, alive with the faith that good work is its own defense. In the memories of those who count the cost, a door remains that opens inward upon a room where a ledger waits. They visit that room less often now. They know the numbers will never change. They close the door and return to the hall and carry the story to those who must learn it, so that they can build a world in which the same trick will not play again with such ease. What do you think truly happened? Share your thoughts in the comments.